Welcome to Back AI Pulse.
Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at some really fascinating data you've brought in from Worldometer, and it all centers around this one massive, constantly changing number, the world population. Right now, it's, ticking up past 8.2 billion people. That was late March 2025. It's a number so huge, it's almost hard to really wrap your head around, isn't it?
It really is. It's just monumental. It
That's
represents,
suppose.
well, everyone on the planet right now. And our deep dive today, using this Worldometer World Population Clock page, which pulls data from key sources like the UN Population Division, the U.S. Census Bureau. It isn't just about staring at that big number. We want to understand its history, where people are, the trends, what it all tells us about, the human story, past, present, and future. It's about making that huge ticking number feel a bit more real, more understandable for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. These aren't just like abstract stats, they're billions of lives. And the patterns in these numbers, they show these profound shifts in how we live.
Yeah.
So let's use this incredible data set you've provided as our map, really trace the path humanity's taken.
Okay. And what's truly striking when you look at the timeline in this data is just how recent this explosive growth actually is. I mean, if you go way back, like 8,000 BC, dawn of agriculture, the estimated world population was tiny, like maybe 5 million people globally.
5 million, that's smaller than a lot of big cities today. It's wow. Hard to picture the whole human race fitting into like one city now.
Exactly. And the growth from there was incredibly slow for thousands of years. Took about 8,000 years to get to maybe 200 to 600 million by 1 AD. The growth rate was almost nothing, less than 0.05% per year. Think about those huge stretches of time
Yeah.
with barely any increase in the total number of people.
Right. And looking at the data points here, it took all of that history from those first few million through empires, plagues, discoveries,
Mm.
all the way up to around 1800. Just to hit the first billion people, the entire human journey for that first billion.
And then
Oh.
something fundamental shifted. After 1800, Industrial Revolution time,
Yeah.
the acceleration is just, well, it's staggering when you see the numbers laid out.
Yeah.
To add the second billion, only 130 years. By 1930,
130 years.
the third billion, just 30 years
Yeah.
by 1960.
30.
The fourth billion, a mere 15 years by 1974.
15 years for a billion people.
And the fifth billion, just 13 years, hit 5 billion by 1987.
Wow. Okay, that pace is just, it's unbelievable. From taking all of history for 1 billion to adding a billion in like just over a decade, what drove that sudden massive shift after 1800?
But it was a mix of things, really, a confluence of factors.
Mhm.
Advances in agriculture meant more food, supporting more people, big one. Then improvements in sanitation, public health, understanding diseases, eventually vaccines, antibiotics. They drastically cut death rates, especially infant mortality.
Ah, okay, so fewer people dying young.
Exactly. People lived longer, more kids survived to adulthood and had their own families. So that gap between birth rates and death rates just widened massively, led to exponential growth. The summary table you shared, it really spells it out. 1 billion to 8 billion, just 218 years, 1804 to 2022. Compare that to over 1,800 years just to get to that first billion from 1 AD. It's stark.
Puts the recent past in such incredible perspective. But looking at the current data, the growth isn't speeding up like that anymore, is it? The source mentions a peak rate sometime in the 60s.
That's right. The annual percentage growth rate peaked around 2% back in the mid-1960s. And this is really key, often misunderstood. The rate of growth has been slowing down quite a bit since then, even though the absolute number added each year stayed high for a long time.
So the speed is decreasing, even if the population's still getting bigger.
Precisely. That rate has nearly halved since the 60s peak. It was 1.25% in 2015, dropped under 1% to 0.97% by 2020. And this data estimates it at 0.85% for 2025.
0.85%. That still sounds like quite a bit when you're starting with 8.2 billion people. How many actual people is that roughly added each year right now?
It's still substantial, yeah. The estimate for 2025 is around 70 million more people globally in 1 year.
70 million? Wow.
But because that rate is applied to a much larger base population now, the time it takes for the population to double has stretched out again. The source points out it only took 40 years to double from 3 billion in 1959 to 6 billion in 1999. 40 years.
Right.
But the data suggests it'll take over 200 years to double from where we are now. Instead, the projection is we'll add maybe half that amount, so reaching 9 billion in the next roughly 40 years. Expected around 2037 based on these numbers.
Okay, so the explosive doubling period seems to be behind us. The pace is easing off, even though, yeah, we're still adding tens of millions every year. What does this slowing rate mean for the future projections then? Where are we headed according to this data?
Well, based on the UN's median fertility projections, that's what this data uses.
Hmm.
The world population is expected to hit 9 billion around 2037, then reach 10 billion maybe around 2060, and after that potentially stabilize or grow really slowly, peaking around 10.2 billion by 2100.
Adding another couple of billion by 2100, still significant, obviously, but it does sound like the steepest part of that growth curve is probably over. What are the underlying demographic changes driving this slowdown?
Yeah, the source table points to a couple of key global trends happening at the same time: median age and fertility rate. Let's take median age first. Globally, it's been going up steadily from about 20.3 years in 1970 to 30.9 in 2025, and projected to hit 36.1 by 2050.
But rising median age, what does that actually mean for societies, day to day?
It means the population, on average, is getting older, fewer young people relative to working-age folks and older people, and that has huge implications for, labor markets, healthcare, pensions, economic dynamism, lots of things.
Right. And tied very closely to that, I imagine, is the fertility rate, also dropping globally.
Exactly, very closely linked. The average number of births per woman has fallen dramatically. It was nearly 4.83 back in 1970. Now in 2025, it's down to 2.24 and projected to be around 2.1 by 2050.
2.1. Isn't that basically replacement level?
Roughly. It is, yeah. Generally considered the level needed to keep a population stable in the long run if you ignore migration.
So globally, we're nearing a point where each generation is just sort of replacing itself, not significantly growing beyond that. And, well, obviously, more people on a finite planet means density is going up too.
Yep, population density is climbing. From 25 people per square kilometer in 1970 to 55 in 2025, projected 65 by 2050. Though, as the source notes, and you can see on maps, it's not evenly spread at all. Some places incredibly crowded, others very sparse.
And speaking of how things are spread out, the source also includes this breakdown by religion. It's based on a 2010 study.
It is, yes. It gives another perspective on humanity's distribution. Important note, this specific data is based on the world back in 2010 when the population was around 6.9 billion, not the current 8.2.
Okay, so a snapshot from then. What did it show?
It showed Christians making up about 31% of the world then, Muslims 23%, people with no religion or affiliation around 16%, Hindus 15%, Buddhists 7%, then folk religions about 6%, other religions 1%, and Jewish people about 0.2%.
And it mentioned geographic concentrations, right? Like Hindus mostly in India.
Yeah, it points out things like that. Hindus overwhelmingly in India, about half of Buddhists in China at that time. Again, it's just a snapshot from 2010 based on that Pew Forum study.
Yeah.
The exact percentages might have shifted a bit since then with growth patterns. We're just relaying the data point as it appeared in the material here.
Got it. Okay, so that's the global picture, some global characteristics. But how does this break down regionally and by country? The 2025 regional data shows really uneven growth and age patterns.
Yeah, this is where it gets much more complex than just those global averages. Really different stories unfolding. Take Asia. Still has the vast majority of people, right? About 4.8 billion, nearly 59% of the world. But its growth rate is actually quite modest now, 0.59%, and its fertility rate is low, 1.87, below replacement level on average across that huge continent.
So Asia's massive, but the main engine of future growth isn't necessarily there anymore.
That's what the data suggests. Africa is the region that really stands out as the primary driver of future population increase. It's currently smaller, around 1.5 billion people, but it has by far the highest growth rate, 2.29%, and the highest fertility rate, nearly 3.95 births per woman.
Wow, big difference.
Huge difference. And it also has the youngest median age globally, just 19.3 years. Plus, it's the least urbanized region at 45%. All this translates, according to this data, to adding roughly 34.7 million people per year, just in Africa.
That's a massive contrast with somewhere like Europe.
Complete opposite end of the spectrum, demographically speaking. Europe has a smaller population, about 744 million. And crucially, it has a negative growth rate, net of 0.09%. Its population is shrinking naturally.
Shrinking?
Yeah, it has the oldest median age globally, 42.8, and the lowest fertility rate, just 1.41. Now, the source does note that significant positive net migration into Europe offsets some of that natural decline.
So migration is a big factor there.
It is, but the underlying birth rate is way below replacement.
Yeah.
And it's highly urbanized, around 76%.
What about the Americas and Oceania?
Well, Latin America and the Caribbean have a pretty large population, relatively high growth still, and incredibly high urbanization, 85.5%. Northern America, U.S. and Canada, moderate growth, also very urbanized,
Yeah.
82.5%, and sees significant net migration boosting its numbers too. Oceania has proportionally high growth, but on a much smaller total population base, moderately urbanized around 66%.
And drilling down into specific countries, the top 20 list confirms India's overtaken China now.
Yes, India is #1 in population according to this 2025 data, and China, #2, is actually showing negative growth in this data set, negative 0.23%, a major shift.
Negative growth in China, that's huge.
Absolutely. The rest of the top 20 includes the usual suspects, USA, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, but also highlights the diversity, with countries like Ethiopia, Mexico, Japan, Germany making the list.
And looking further down the country tables, you really see those extreme variations in growth and age you mentioned for the regions.
You really do. You see countries, often in Africa, with very high fertility young populations, driving really rapid growth, like DR Congo, Niger, Angola, Uganda growth rates well over 2.5%. And also places like Syria and Yemen in the Middle East showing very high rates too in this data.
And the other side.
Then you see countries with significant population decline, especially in Eastern Europe. Ukraine showing a very sharp drop here, but also Poland, Czech Republic, Greece, Romania. Negative growth over 0.5%, sometimes much more. And the age extremes are just vivid. Niger, median age around 15.5. Japan, nearly 50. Median age 49.8.
These differences really hammer home that the global average hides so much variation. It's not one story, is it? It's many different demographic stories playing out.
That's a crucial takeaway. Absolutely. And speaking as the vastness of the human story,
Yeah.
the source includes this fascinating calculation about how many people have ever lived on Earth. And it tackles that old misconception.
Right. The idea from the 70s that like 75% of everyone who'd ever lived was alive then, which just feels wrong.
It is wrong, yeah. The estimate is tricky, obviously. You have to make assumptions. Like when modern Homo sapiens appeared, maybe 50,000 BC, then estimate populations and growth rates over millennia.
Yeah.
Very hard for early periods. But using demographic models, the total number ever born is estimated around 106 billion. Most estimates fall somewhere between 90 and 110 billion.
106 billion people throughout all of history. And here's the bit from the source that really puts today in perspective. Our current population, the 8.2 billion alive now, is only about 6% of all the humans estimated to have ever lived on Earth. Just 6%.
Yeah. We're just a tiny recent slice of the total human experience on the planet. It's
Okay.
quite humbling, actually.
Definitely. So finally, it's probably worth touching on how these huge numbers, these projections, are actually put together. It's not like someone's literally counting every birth and death in real time across the globe, right?
No, definitely not. It's a very sophisticated estimation process. Worldometer, as we said, mainly synthesizes data from the big players, the UN Population Division, the U.S. Census Bureau, and they base their estimates and projections on national census data from individual countries, combined with stats on births, deaths, migration, where they have it.
So they're building on official figures from countries themselves.
Exactly. But importantly, these big institutions, they evaluate that national data. They adjust for potential undercounting or inconsistencies. They try to make it as accurate and comparable globally as possible.
Which means the number we see ticking up on a population clock isn't a literal real-time count happening right that second.
Correct. There's always a time lag in getting and processing data from everywhere. So the current world population number isn't necessarily a projection. It's the best estimate based on the latest available data and the trends they derive from it. And as new census data or surveys come in, the models get refined. Past estimates, even current figures, can sometimes be adjusted.
Okay.
The source mentions, for example, the UN and the U.S. Census had slightly different estimated dates for hitting the 7 and 8 billion milestones. That just highlights the inherent uncertainty in pinpointing an exact moment.
That makes perfect sense. It's this incredibly complex picture built from tons of data constantly being refined. And the point about Worldometer's clock showing one consistent global number, not tied to your local time zone,
Right.
that reinforces it's a single estimate.
Right. It ensures everyone sees the same estimated milestone based on the global models, not just a number ticking over because midnight passed locally. As they point out, the exact second a billion milestone is hit is ultimately unknowable for sure because it's all estimation. But the clock shows the best projection consistently.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. From, a handful of ancient humans to over 8.2 billion today. We've seen that incredible acceleration driven by things like the Industrial Revolution, followed by the current slowdown in the rate of growth, which is key. We've explored global shifts like rising median age, falling fertility, looked at the religious distribution snapshot from 2010, and
Yeah.
then really zoomed in on those stark differences between regions and countries: growth, decline, age, migration.
Mhm.
We even put our current numbers in the context of everyone who's ever lived and looked under the hood at how these estimates are made.
And it's crucial to remember these aren't just numbers on a page. They reflect billions of individual lives, billions of challenges, opportunities playing out globally. They influence everything: societal structures, global economics, resource demands. The source mentions related topics like food and water, environmental pressures. Everything.
It really is this dynamic, constantly evolving picture. And think about the future. The projections show continued growth, yeah, towards maybe 10.2 billion by 2100, but with that slower global rate we discussed. Yet underneath that overall trend, we saw those huge regional contrasts. Rapid growth in some places with young populations, decline in others with aging populations, and migration playing an increasingly important role.
Which leads to a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about. Given these very different demographic paths unfolding across the world, this global slowdown masking rapid growth here, contraction there, alongside these shifts in age and migration, what do these contrasting trends really mean for the specific challenges and also the specific opportunities facing different societies and maybe the world as a whole in the decades ahead?